Hey everyone, welcome back to the next episode of the 2021 March Madness Bracket Battle here for the tournament. It was a really awesome slate of games today, very chalky in the beginning half of it. All the high seeds seemed to be the ones that were winning, and then the lower seeds started to pull off some more upsets in that later slate of games. But really fun overall to watch. There was a lot of close calls, like I said, a couple upsets as well. But moving on to the March 20th slate of games, we'll look at our best brackets, worst brackets, and all that, and then move on to the overall rankings in just a second. But the best bracket we had today were the chalk brackets and the points per game brackets. So those chalk brackets, like I said, are all going to be lumped together in one until we get to the Final Four. Let me grab those. When we get to the Final Four, they'll start to break off because that's when you see the variance and where the number one seeds are and such. But they had 12 wins today each, so the points per game and chalk brackets had 12 wins of 12 possible points out of 16, so only 4 wrong. For the points per game, they had the Drake, Eastern Washington, BYU, and and the UConn games incorrect. And for the chalk, they had the BYU, Texas, UConn, and Virginia games incorrect. So you can see that's where the bigger upsets came. That's why you can see it was pretty, like I said, chalky day, not many upsets. There were just a few in there, but a lot of really close games for the entire slate, which was really cool to see. The worst bracket today was the points per game allowed. They were, I think, on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. They only had 4 wins, so not a super great showing for those defensive teams. I also think it's really interesting seeing that the points per game, or what we'll see on the overall as well, the points per game and points per game allowed are on 2 opposite ends of the spectrums in terms of how they're performing. So I think it's kind of maybe showing that the offense is really starting to show more than the defense is in this tournament. You've obviously had some pretty good defensive games, but it seems like overall there's been more emphasis, or I guess it's more emphasized on points per game. But then again, we're really just going off of stats that we found on the website. There's a lot of intangibles to consider, but that's just an observation I found for today. For our best regions, it was the chalk and random numbers regions. The West regions for each of those had 7 out of 8 possible points, so 2 really strong days for them. My writing's all slanting upwards, so I'm sorry if that's hard to read. For the chalk brackets, the only game they missed was the Virginia-Ohio game, obviously Virginia being the higher seed. And then for the random numbers bracket, the only game that it missed, almost had a chance at a perfect region for that bracket, but it missed out because Oregon and VCU was called no contest and Oregon was put through, and the random numbers selector chose VCU in this case. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But I want to move on to the overall bracket rankings. Currently, so we have the chalk bracket and random numbers bracket are tied in first place with 22 out of a possible 32 points. The points per game bracket is coming in right behind that at 21. I think that random numbers bracket is when you'll start to see fall off a little bit, though. It had a really strong showing so far, but it's missing a couple big teams going forward. Georgia Tech's in the Final Four. They lost in the first round. Mount St. Mary's gets into the Sweet 16 in this one. They lost in the first 4, Georgetown's the big one. They won the title game in this one and the coin flip bracket, and they're out of the tournament as well in the first round. So that one will start to fall off a little bit more in the next round as we move forward. I only scored for this first set of games. I didn't go forward and score all the other rounds as like X's or checks yet. So we'll look at those getting into the next round. But moving on, we also have the most wins bracket with 15 points in 4th place, the coin flip bracket with 14 points in 5th place. The scoring margin is also tied with that coin flip bracket in 5th with 14 points. The win percentage bracket has 12, the least losses bracket has 10 points, and the points per game allowed is in last place with 8 out of a possible 32. That was one of Brad's bets, Brad's bad bet, that it would be one of the worst brackets because I think that was the one that had all 4 of the 16 seeds going through in the first round. Obviously, none of those upsets happened, so it's struggling, and it'll probably continue to struggle as we move forward. But really cool to see how those brackets have started to perform. Like I said, it's interesting to see how we have points per game, which is just 1 point off of first place, and then points per game allowed, which is in dead last by a very, very high margin. So it'll be cool to see if that sticks throughout, or if maybe defense starts to become a little bit more prevalent in some of these games that we're watching. But moving on to my thoughts on some of the games today. Didn't watch as many of them as I wanted to, just was kind of getting out and about a little bit more. I'm going to already say that I probably won't watch as many tomorrow because I have to work. tomorrow for a little bit, so I'll do my best to try and catch up on those, but definitely wanted to talk about my favorite games, standout players and teams, and then a big surprise that I found in the day. My favorite games to watch were the UC Santa Barbara and Creighton game, and then the Texas Abilene Christian game. I put the Texas Abilene Christian just recently. It just ended up, like I said, but it was really fun to watch. Great win for Abilene Christian. It'll be interesting to see if they move along. Abilene Christian was pretty heavily favored in my brackets in terms of like the statistical ones. Texas only in terms of like the stat-based ones and not the chalk brackets. Obviously, it was winning in all of the chalk ones, but in the stat-based brackets, I think only one or two had Texas moving through in the next round. So Abilene Christian was pretty heavily favored. They're in the Final Four in one of my brackets, and I think in the Sweet 16 or Elite 8 in a couple more of them. So if they keep winning, that's good for those. Not as good for my personal brackets. Those actually I forgot to mention as well. Out of the three main ones I have, one has 21 points and two of them have 19, so they kind of fall right in there in third and fourth place, tied up. I'm not really tracking those with those stat brackets, the criteria brackets that we filled out. I'm just kind of using those as a reference point, I guess. So those are performing pretty well. Hopefully they keep doing so. But also, like I said, the UCSB, UC Santa Barbara and Creighton game was a really strong one. Really close game, came down to the wire, just like the Texas Abilene Christian game. But I think overall the USCSB and Creighton game, they both had really balanced scoring. It seemed like everyone was doing their part to contribute, especially in those starting fives. Had a lot of good athletes and was just overall a really, really fun game to watch. Definitely the one I watched like the most of consistently. I think I sat down and watched that one end to end. The other ones I was kind of hopping around and got little bits and pieces of it, but two really fun games there. For my standout players, I have four technically, but kind of three because I'm grouping two of them together. The first, David McCormick from Kansas, who hadn't played since March 4th. This was his first game back for Kansas. He practiced yesterday, as I throw my marker around. Practiced yesterday with the team. I think 70% they said wearing a heart rate monitor because he's coming off of COVID protocols. So he scored 22 points and was a really big standout in their win against Eastern Washington. Lumping in with that, the Groves brothers from Eastern Washington combined for 58 points against Kansas. So a really strong showing for those two brothers there. It'll be disappointing that they're out now because it would have been cool to see them play a little bit more and see if they would be able to replicate that success. But definitely a shout out to them for such a strong and amazing performance. Jason Preston from Ohio is my last standout player. He almost had a triple-double in the game against Virginia. He was 2 assists shy, I believe. And he's just got a really neat story as well. If you hadn't heard, he wasn't recruited out of high school. He was only 6 feet tall and 140 pounds and didn't really have any looks. Went into college to become a sports writer, much like I'm doing. Was asked by a friend if he would join the AAU team that he was on because they were missing a player for a tournament. He actually got some looks at the tournament. Ended up dropping out of college, going to a prep school to start to focus a little bit on basketball, made his own game film out of doing screen recordings and stuff on his phone. So basically put together his whole highlight package and ended up getting a couple offers and committed to Ohio, where he's been for 2 seasons. This is his second season and has become a really integral part of their team. He scored, I think, like 30-something points in a really close loss to Illinois earlier this year, who's obviously one of the number 1 seeds. So awesome to see him doing well. Hopefully he'll continue to do well because I think he's got a really cool story and that he's just also a really fantastic player. My standout teams, one, Gonzaga. They had a super convincing win against Norfolk State today by 43, I think it was. So they kind of came out and said, we're the team to beat. So, come do your best, try and beat us. They'll have a pretty tough matchup against Oklahoma in the next round, but I think they really proved that they deserve to be where they are and ranked how they are in this tournament so far. So that's why they're one of my standout teams. The other is Florida State, who going into the game against UNC Greensboro, they were ranked the 7th best 3-point percent shooting team in the country. So a top 10 3-point shooting per team based off percentage. And they didn't hit a single three in today's game. I think they only attempted 9 or 10. So clearly they found out they weren't falling. But, when something like that's really your bread and butter throughout the season isn't falling, sometimes it's hard to win. And you could see that UNC Greensboro was giving the Florida State Seminoles fits early on in the game, but they started to pull away pretty convincingly. And really showed that they don't need to hit the threes to win games and pulled out a really solid win against a pretty solid UNC Greensboro team who was giving them shouts at an upset early on. So that's why they were my standout team. And then my big surprise is the VCU Oregon game being called no contest. I'm not surprised that it was called no contest. I'm just kind of surprised that it happened. It's really unfortunate. There were multiple positive tests within the VCU program from what's been reported. Just crazy to see how that COVID is still affecting our lives on a day-to-day basis. Really stinks for those VCU players. I know they had a lot of solid players, especially Bones Highland, who was the A10 player of the year this year in the league. Mike Rhodes, I know my heart goes out to him and that whole team, even though they are University of Richmond's biggest rivals. You just never want to see a team go out like that. It's, you want at least to give them a fighting chance. So, hopefully everyone stays safe there, gets home safe, and recovers well from that virus. But just definitely the biggest surprise of the day was having that flash across my Twitter feed as I'm watching some of the games. So like I said, hopefully we don't have any more of that so we can go through a pretty normal March Madness tournament, but crazy to see. So it was, like I said, a pretty big slate of games in terms of Brad's bets that I mentioned earlier. We've got a few that are still in play. The chalk number 2 and 5 brackets were the ones that I picked as being potentially the best because they had the Gonzaga-Illinois matchup in the final, and that went both ways. So it's the chalk brackets you can see are still tied for first place in our rankings. So they are still well on their way to being a confirmed best bet. So that's a good one there. We also talked about how the points per game allowed bracket wasn't very strong to start off with. It had all 4 of the number 16 seeds moving out of the first round, which clearly didn't happen. All the number 1 seeds won, so that's why it's sat at the bottom, and I think it'll continue to sit at the bottom for the rest of this unless one of these brackets just really tanks. It is March. You never know what's going to happen. Mentioning Brad, he's sitting up there on his little perch again tonight. So that was one of the bets. And then Loyola Chicago going into the Sweet 16 was one of the other ones that we had mentioned as well. And they're still in. They have Illinois in the next round, so a tough battle, but definitely a winnable game. Like we said earlier in the breakdown video, really strong defensive team. So if they can hold Illinois to some bad shots or some low shooting percentages, definitely a chance for them to move on. So that bet is still alive as well. I think these are just going to be bets that only kind of run for those first couple rounds. When we get into the Sweet 16 and Elite 8 and then Final 4 and Final, I'll also do some more bad bets and best bets with Brad there. This one was just for the first couple rounds. There's a little 4 or 5 day period or so in between the second round and Sweet 16. So hopefully I'll be able to take my time, look at a couple more of those. We'll do a little preview video most likely and do a couple more best bets and then pick another one of the brackets that we think is going to stand out and do pretty poorly. So again, really appreciate you guys' support in this whole series. If you've been sticking through it, it's been a lot of fun for me to watch all these games and follow along and, come in super late at night and write all these up. But I really appreciate you if you guys are following along, and I will see you guys in the next video. So bye.